In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into some of the features and options that we have, some of the tools that we have within workflows as we're designing those, but also look at some of the best practices that we need to keep in mind. We're going to start with some of the fundamentals because as we're building these workflows, we need to make sure that we have a strong foundation to build on. Many of these basics, these fundamentals, are going to be covered in the Blasting Off with Workflows manual on our community site, the cover of which is shown here. After we talk about some of these basics, we'll get into some advanced options and some fun tools that are available for you in workflows. The first thing I want to talk about is how and why we set logging levels on our workflows. The log for a workflow is really designed just for use while you're debugging your workflow. Once something's designed, if it's not working properly, we need to go in and debug and figure out why it's doing what it's doing and why it's not doing what we intended it to do. We don't need logging level turned on while the workflow is actually being used in production when nothing's going wrong, when we're not doing this debugging. Usually, even when you're debugging, you don't even need the logging level turned on either. What the log does is it allows you to see what order things happened in. So from the top to the bottom or from beginning to end throughout your entire workflow, what actions and activities have been activated and run and done their job or which got skipped. That can be useful, as I say, when you're debugging your workflow. But once you're done, when you no longer need that, make sure that you come back to the design of your workflow and set that logging level back to none. The reason we say that is if you have even a basic workflow that has logging turned on, you can very quickly create a lot of records that have to get written to your database. You can see here an example from the Contact Us form on the demo external website. This is a very basic workflow, and all we did in this example was fill out the Contact Us form on the external site, and then based on the answers that we gave, the workflow got assigned to somebody on staff. Just taking those actions, you can see, wrote 124 records to the database. So that represents some storage space that's taking up. But more importantly than the storage is the realization that we had to write all of these records individually to the database. Writing to the database is one of the most time-consuming things we can ask our servers to do. We want our workflows to be fast, so that's the main reason we keep logging turned off. This becomes more and more important if there's a chance that lots of people are going to be using the same type of workflow at the same time. If your pastor is standing on stage and asks everyone to pull out their phones and go to a page on your site where they fill out one of these workflow forms, that's a lot of records that have to get written. And we don't want those to pile up and have to take their turn and slow down your whole system. So keep logging level turned off and minimize the amount of writing that we have to do to the database. One more tip on logging. You may find that even when you are debugging your workflow, you still don't need the logging turned on. That's because if your workflow is persisted, we're automatically getting information about which actions have run and when they were completed, and you can see that by clicking on the Activities tab when you look at an individual workflow. The main difference between this screen and the log is that the log shows you a single view, a single timeline of all of the actions from the beginning to the end of the workflow. But this view is a little bit more organized in that it groups all of the actions by the activity that they're in. So on this view, you can see the last time that an action was processed, and if it was completed, then you can even see what time it was completed. And you know that the actions are going to run within an activity from top to bottom. So if you've got a workflow that only has a single activity or only runs a single activity at a time, you already know what order they execute in, and we're already storing what time they've run. So there's really no need in a workflow like that to see the log, to see everything regardless of what activity it's in and when it was run, because we can look at this and get all the same information. So every time you design a workflow, make sure that you unlock the achievement of logging properly. Now let's talk about persisted workflows. Active workflows are like a program that you leave running in the background of your computer, or lots of tabs that you leave open on your browser. Sometimes in the case of workflows, we see churches that have workflows that have been active for years. These are little programs in your Rock environment that are having to get evaluated and they're taking up resources. And if it's years later, we know that's wasted effort. So there's a new feature added in version 13 of Rock, and that's the maximum workflow age. This is the number of days that we want to mark a workflow as completed after. So in this particular workflow, I might say, hey, Rock, if this workflow has been running for 30 days, let's consider it abandoned. There's no valid reason it should ever run for that long. So by setting this value to 30 days, Rock is going to find workflows of this type that have been running longer than that, and it's going to automatically complete those workflows. So now those programs are closed. They're not running in the background anymore. We can even combine that setting with the completed workflow retention period setting. That setting is going to allow us to no longer store the records of old workflows. So we can have Rock delete them from the database after they've been complete for a certain number of days. So the first setting protects your server's performance. We don't want to leave workflows running in the background day after day and year after year. The second setting is going to help you keep your database file size small. And they can be used very nicely in conjunction with each other. So here's some more information about persisted workflows. If a workflow is persisted, that just means that it has a record that it's running or that it has run, and that record is written in the database. There's a few ways to indicate that workflows of this type should be persisted, that they should be written to the database. By default, when you create a new workflow, you'll see that the automatically persisted setting is checked. That means as soon as workflows of this type start running, it's going to get written to the database. So as soon as this workflow starts, there will be a record of everything that it does, and as long as it's running, you'll be able to come back to that workflow and do things that it needs, like fill out the form that it's waiting for you to fill out. So this setting is great for those times that we need to know every time this type of workflow runs, or if we need a record of every time that it runs. But usually that's not really what we need. Let's say you have a workflow where the first thing it does is to ask the person to fill out a form. And let's say we have a page that whenever we view that page, the workflow starts to show the form. If we automatically persist that type of a workflow, we're going to see in the database that we've got a record of every time that form was shown, even if it was never filled out. So you might have a long list of all of these workflows that have run, and only 2 of these 8 actually have somebody that filled out the form. The other 6 are still active. They're running. There are programs running in the background, but nobody's filled them out. They're actually worthless records. They're worthless uses of those resources because no one's ever going to get back to that. Even if the person who loaded that page and caused this workflow to start running comes back to that page later, Rock is going to create a new workflow. It's not going to take them back to the old one that they started last time. So in cases like this, we only want to persist the workflow once there's a reason to. So once they actually fill out and submit the form, then we want to persist the workflow and not before. Here's an example of what a workflow with that kind of design looks like. Our first action is going to show the form, and then after the form is complete and gets submitted, then it'll move on to the second action, and that is to persist the workflow. So that puts the workflow into the mode of being persisted, and everything that happens from that point on automatically gets written to the database, and we've got this paper trail. The third option when you're considering how to persist your workflow is to not persist it at all. And I know that seems counterintuitive, but you need to understand that most workflows don't need to be persisted because the workflow can run, it can take actions, it can update records, it can add people to groups, it can send emails, it can do all kinds of things. But if there's no need to have a record of that, again, think of your paper trail. If you don't need the paper trail saying that that workflow ran, then there's no need to persist it. Remember, writing records to the database is the most time-consuming thing that we can ask our server to do. Persisting a workflow has to write a lot of records. So if the point of a workflow is just to do something or just to update something in Rock, let that be enough and be satisfied with not needing the paper trail that it actually ran. If the point of a workflow is to create a note, then if you look at somebody's profile and that note is there, you know that it was put there by the workflow. We don't need the record that the workflow ran. If the point is to add someone to a group, then the fact that they're in that group means that the workflow ran and we don't need that paper trail. Or if the point is to write an interaction or send a message, we can even optionally store a record of that message that got sent in the person's history. Or if we want to create a connection request or just make an update to another record, then these are great examples of workflows that don't need to be persisted or written to the database because they will take those actions. They will do what they need to do without leaving that paper trail that has to get stored. Now let's talk about a fun tool that you may not realize existed, workflow descriptions. Okay, you probably do actually know that workflow descriptions existed. We talk about these as being the love letter to our future selves. And you probably know that the description should include information about why we created the workflow and where it gets used and how long we might need this workflow to be here and what else in Rock might control how it runs. And I know that when you're designing the workflow, that all seems really obvious. But in 6 months or a few years from now, or even the next person to come along and need to maintain the database after you, it's not going to be so obvious. A lot of churches make minimal use of the descriptions, partly because everything that you want to get in there is a lot of text. But here's what I want to share is that those descriptions don't have to just be text. You can make these descriptions really rich and useful for your future self. So they're almost a joy to come back to later. The description field when you're designing a workflow is actually in truth a markdown field. So you can add things like links and headers and bullet lists and numbered lists and lots of other page features like you see here. The format for lists are going to be a one item per line with a star at the front of it. So if we have a star and a space, then whatever we have on that item will show up in the bullet list. The format for headings are going to use the pound sign. So an H3, if you're thinking in terms of HTML, is going to be a middle-sized header. The equivalent for that in Markdown is 3 of those pound signs. So if we've got 3 pound signs in requirements, then we get this nice requirements heading. And then whatever text under that is going to show up under the heading. If you want to have links, like if we're linking to this involvement connection type or the schedule type defined value, the way that you do that in Markdown is to have your text in the square braces and the URL in parentheses directly after that. So this is going to link the text volunteer interview to the volunteer interview page, volunteer success to the volunteer success page. This is just going to show the word involvement and link you to the people connections types 1 connection type page. So now you can richly format your descriptions and have the workflow description be your single source of all the information about how it runs and what it needs and where you can go to start making other changes if you need to maintain it in the future. Now let's talk a little bit about the structure and the flow of workflows. Specifically, what makes them up and how do they run when they run? Obviously, at the base level, we've got a workflow. That workflow is going to have certain attributes. Anything that we want to know or store or look up or display probably needs to be stored in a workflow attribute. So every time a workflow runs, it's going to have a record. And within that workflow, there's going to be at least one activity. That activity can also have attributes. The attributes inside that activity are only available to the actions inside that activity. But the point of the activity is that it holds your actions. The actions within an activity are going to run in order from top to bottom. So if we've got an activity that looks like this in our workflow, then action 1 is going to run, and once that's done running, it's going to go to action 2, and then 3, and then 4. The way that actions and activities relate to their workflow can be thought of in an analogy of programming. So this is a little bit more of a technical video. I don't mind jumping into some sample code like this, and the analogy isn't perfect, so don't read too deeply into this. But let's say that we've got a workflow represented by a JavaScript block of code on our page. We might have some global attributes that would be kind of like our workflow attributes. So we're storing the state of these two characters in this fictional movie that we're just making up here. And then we've got a series of functions. If you've got any experience with scripting or with coding, you probably realize that the order that the functions are defined in don't really matter. Something has to call those functions. Once the function gets called or gets activated, then it's going to do everything within it in order. So each of these functions, we've got this character Greedo and this character Han, and then someone's going to apologize for the mess. These are going to be functions in our code. That's kind of like different activities in our workflow. So something has to call each of those. And let's say that our director decided that he wants to mix up who shoots first. So we can go ahead and make it look like we've got this order where Greedo shoots and then Han shoots and then someone's going to apologize for the mess. But what actually matters is that something gets called. So even though Greedo shoots gets defined first and Han second, what gets called is Han shoots, and then that's going to call the fact that Greedo shoots, and then we've got someone apologizing for the mess. So the order that an activity is defined in doesn't matter. We need to activate the activity, and then the actions or the commands in this analogy will run in order. All right, so maybe that made some sense to some people. If we lost you, no worries. We'll just move on and talk about actual workflows, and we'll move off of the analogy. So let's say that we've got this workflow, and it's got two attributes. Each of those attributes can have a value set that any of the actions in the workflow can set or use or read. And then this workflow has three different activities. And we've just defined them, we've called them activity 1, activity 2, and activity 3. Activity 3 has its own set of attributes. So we'll talk about what that looks like in a minute. So as an example, let's say that activity 1 gets set to run as soon as the workflow starts. So the workflow starts, activity 1 gets activated, it gets called. It's going to start running action 1. As soon as that's done, then it goes to action 2. Let's say in this example that action 2 says go and activate activity 2. And then activity 2 is going to start running through its actions. The role of that action 2 is go and mark that as active though, so it's immediately going to go on to action 3, and maybe action 3 says go and activate this other activity. This is how we can start running multiple activities kind of at the same time and get some branching logic. Or we could run them very much in order. We could say run activity 1, but when it gets to action 2 in there, it's going to activate this activity. That's going to run actions 1, 2, 3, and 4 inside of it, and then it's going to go and activate activity 3. So as the workflow designer, you get to determine when these activities get called so that you can sequence them or have them running at the same time. You can even create loops this way. If activity 3 has the ability to activate activity 2 again, now we need to start understanding better how workflows actually run. So let's walk through this as an example. Let's say that when activity 1 gets activated at the beginning of your workflow, it's going to run action 1, and then action 2 runs. That's going to come over here and mark activity 2 as active. So now we have two activities active. What's actually going to happen in your workflow, though, is activity 1 is the one with the current focus. So once action 2 comes over here and says, hey, activity 2, just mark yourself as active. If anybody asks, you're running. That action is now done, so it immediately goes on to action 3 in the first activity, and then action 4. Now the workflow looks around and says, okay, we've got to the end of activity 1. I've run all of those actions. So activity 1 is no longer active. That activity is now complete. So the workflow says, is there anything else to do? And it spots activity 2 over here. It says, yeah, I'm active. It says, okay, well, let's start going through that. So in activity 2, now it's going to run action 1 and 2 and 3. Then it gets to action 4, which says, come over and set this activity as active. So the action that that's going to take is to add this lightning bolt that I'm using here to mark activity 3 as active. Action 4 on this side is now done because its role was to say go and turn on that switch. It's not waiting for activity 3 to be done. It just says it's now active. So now that all of those 4 activities have run, activity 2 is now complete. So it's no longer active because there's nothing left for it to do. So now activity 3 is active, and the workflow says, is there anything to do? Activity 3 says, yes, I'm active. So we're going to start going through action 1 and 2. Maybe these actions are setting the activity attributes. So action 1 might have set a value in attribute 3, and action 2 might have set a value in attribute 4. And then we're going to get to action 3. Now in this action, we've got a filter. So we're only going to run this action sometimes. In this case, the logic in our theoretical workflow is to say we're going to go ahead and run action 3. Action 3 says come back and activate activity 2. What actually happens here is that we just activated another copy of activity 2. So it's not redoing the same things that it did last time. It's copying it and it's running it again, or it's running another copy. So activity 2, or a new copy of activity 2, is now set as active. Action 3 over here is done. We're going to go on to action 4. Now activity 3 is done. The workflow looks around and says, is there anything else to do? The new copy of activity 2 says, yep, I'm active. So it's going to run through action 1, action 2, action 3. Once it gets to action 4, it's going to come and activate another new copy of activity 3. And then activity 2 is done. So now we move on to the new copy of activity 3. It's going to run action 1 and action 2. Let's say that this time it skips action 3, and we're going to run action 4. So now that all of those are done, activity 3 is done. So we've got no more active activities. So the workflow looks around and says, is there anything else left active? If it doesn't find anything, now it's going to get marked as complete. So our workflow is now marked as complete. It's never going to run again, this particular copy. So understanding how that all ran, let's look at what we would see in the activity log. So we've got our workflow, and it had 2 attributes, and something in our workflow set a date to attribute 1, and it set the value true to attribute 2. What we see run is activity 1 ran, and activity 2 ran, and then activity 3 ran, and it's got some attributes set. And then we've got another copy of activity 2. So if there's nothing dynamic about these, they might have done exactly the same thing as each other. But when you're looking at what has actually gotten entered or gotten run in that workflow, it's 2 copies of the same activities. So activity 1, 2, and 3 ran, and then another copy of activity 2 and another copy of activity 3. Now you can see the reason that we copy those activities whenever we activate them is each of those activities, if they have attributes, they can have different values in each of those attributes. So the first activity 3, attribute 3, might be Ted Decker, but the second time it ran, it's going to be Cindy Decker. And the first time activity 3 ran, attribute 4 picked the Decker group, and the second time, or the second copy of activity 3, when it ran, it picked the prayer group for Cindy Decker. So when we activate those activities, what it really does is it grabs the current version of those activities from the workflow type, and it adds them into this current workflow and runs through that. Every time we activate an activity, that's the process. That's why they get written into the database then when we activate them and not before. So this is an example of what you can see on the Activities tab when we look at a specific workflow that has been persisted, which means written to the database. Now let's talk about some advanced forms, some advanced tools for forms as we're designing those. I want to look at some custom button styles, which is probably something that the first time you read through the manuals, you thought was pretty cool, and then you went and you looked at all of the available button styles and couldn't really think of anything new to create, so you probably promptly forgot about it. But let's create an example here. I want to show you how to make a back button. So our normal styles are things like the primary and the secondary, and then we've got an approve button that's colored green and it's got a check mark, and a deny button that's red and it's got a circle with a line through it. And then we've got a success button that's just green, and a danger button that's yellow, an info that's blue, and a warning button that's yellow. There's also a cancel button. And the function of a cancel button is kind of special because the buttons at the bottom of a workflow form usually try and make sure that the required fields in that form have been filled out. So if I click one of our primary buttons or a success or a deny button, it's going to make sure that if I've got a button or an input that is marked as required, that I've actually provided a value in that field before it lets me submit the form. But for a cancel button, that doesn't really make sense. And likewise for a back button. If we want to create a back button and be able to navigate from one form to the next and then back to the first one, we don't want you to have to fill out everything in that second form just to be able to go back to the first one. So we're going to create a new back button style, and we're going to copy that from the cancel button template. So this is what comes in, and what we need to make sure is that onClick equals return true is in there. That's what tells Rock whenever we click a button with the style, don't go and validate the form items. If something's required, allow it to be blank. If I click a button with this onClick equals return true in it. What we're adding to the back button though is I want to add a little left arrow. So that's going to be our Font Awesome icon of chevron left. So it's going to give us a left arrow before it shows the text on the button. So most of this is the same as cancel. Cancel has that onClick equals return true. And in our back button, we just want to add this I class equals fa chevron left, and then we'll close that I tag. So that's going to give us a button that logically looks like a back button. So using that in our new workflow that we're going to create, let's say that we've got a couple different forms, and I'm going to have each of those forms in different activities. So we're going to have 3 different forms. I want you to be able to go from the first form to the second form to the third form, but I want you to be able to go from the third form to the second and the second back to the first and change your answers if you need to go back to those. So what we're really looking at here is an easy way to move from one form to the next and then back to a previous form. So let's say that our workflow design, the first activity has this one action in it, and that is show this form. And we're asking for field 1 and field 2. Maybe we've used one of our nice Lava shortcodes to show a progress bar up at the top, and we're using the pre-HTML on the form to add some information about how you're viewing page 1. So I fill out some information in field 1 and field 2. Since my next button is just a normal button, it's going to make sure that I actually provide something. It's not going to let me move on to page 2 unless I fill in field 1 and field 2, because those are both required. So let's say that I do that and I click next. Now we're on page 2. We've got our progress bar, we've got the heading up here, and we've got some different fields that we're prompting for. Now here's that back button that we used. So we've got 2 buttons on this form now. We've got the back button and the next button. And the reason it's important to copy that back button from the cancel button is because I don't want to have to fill in something for field 3 and for field 4 just so I can click back. If I'd used the secondary button or one of the other button types, if I clicked back, it's going to say, nope, you haven't filled in some information here. So that's why we needed to create a new button style with that left arrow that doesn't validate our form. So we went from page 1 to page 2. Now we can click next to go to page 3. And if we go back, then we want to go back to page 2. If we click back, we go back to page 1. And then we can go next and next. And once we get to the last page, then we can click submit. So let's think about if each of those forms are in their own activity, how did this work? How did we move from one to the next? Well, we said in the start, we started with the form, and then we clicked next, and we went to form 2. We clicked next to form 3, then we went back to form 2. We clicked next to form 3. The way that we're doing that is in our workflow, we've designed those buttons to say activate a specific activity whenever I click this button. So once we've run this process where we go 1, 2, 3, and then we went back, and then we went next, and then we submit, here's what we're going to see in that workflow as far as what activities actually ran. First, it runs a copy of first form, then it runs a copy of second form, then it ran a copy of third form, then it made a new copy and ran second form again. So when I clicked that back button said, when I click that, activate the activity second form. So it didn't go back and reactivate the same second form here. Remember, it created a new copy of second form, but it's going to run exactly the same way as the first one. And the nice thing is, as long as the forms are prompting for workflow attributes, it's going to be the same for all of your actions. So when I get back to my second form and it's showing me fields 3 and 4, it's still showing me the information that I provided last time. So when I go back to the second form, it's not starting blank. It still shows me what I had filled in, so I can make changes and click next and then go back to the third form, and it's going to prompt for fields 5 and 6. So whenever you click any button, it's going to save anything that you have filled into those forms. And as long as they're workflow action or workflow attributes, then when you go back to view them later, they're still going to be filled in. And then in this example, after we click submit on the third form, it's going to go and activate this last activity that we call post form wrap up, in which maybe we send an email, or maybe we create a connection request or add a note to a person profile, whatever we want it to do. So we need to remember how activities run. When they clicked back, as we said, it added another second form activity. But since that form action is now complete, the third form activity is free to continue. So we clicked back on the third form, and so it can move on. Now, what we need to see here is that if we want some actions to run after a form, we need to make sure that the actions are at the top of the next form. Because what we're concerned about here is that if we said prompt for fields 5 and 6, and they clicked back, it's going to say, all right, that action is done, so now I'm going to move on. And if our next action assumes that they clicked submit, we don't actually know what they clicked here. So it's going to run that action, and that's not really where we intended it to run. What we should do instead is move this, okay, they definitely clicked submit here, move that into your post form wrap up activity. So we prompt for fields 5 and 6. If you click back, it's just going to go straight to the second form. Next would go straight to the third form. And then only once you click submit would this, okay, they definitely clicked submit action run. So make sure that your activities are at the top of the next, make sure that your actions are at the top of the next activity rather than after the forms in the current activity. All right, let's talk about how to make your workflows smart. We want to give your workflows some information before they start so that they don't have to ask for it once they're already running. We'll start off really basic. Let's say that we've got a workflow with a form in here asking for somebody's nickname. So if we've got a page that just says we go to our church's website /form, and that's going to run this workflow, that workflow presents a form, and it's got a workflow attribute of what's your nickname, it's going to start off blank unless we provide a default. But if we wanted to link somebody to this workflow or link them to the form and we already know their nickname, we can add something to the URL. So we could come up here and add what's called the URL parameter and give that a value and the key. So the key is going to match your workflow attribute key. When we create an attribute, it always asks us for the key, and in Lava, that's how you're going to look up those values that are associated with those attributes. So if we've got a workflow attribute and it's got a key of nickname, and capitalization match counts here, so make sure that there are capital N's on both of those in your workflow and in what you provide in the page parameter. We can say automatically start this workflow and fill in nickname equals Ted. So when that workflow starts, it's going to take TED, whatever we provided up here, as the value, and put that into the attribute value with the matching key from the URL. So now when I start this page, it says, give me your nickname, but it's showing what value that attribute already has. So that's a really great way of providing some information to the workflow at the point where they click on the link, rather than having to have the workflow ask for that information. So here's the key that we were using. When we added that workflow attribute, it asks for the key. That's where we specified nickname. That's what has to match up in that address bar. So here's another example. Let's say that we want to preset something like a connection request. So we've got a different workflow, and it's going to show us a form and ask what connection request we want to make some changes to. So if we've got a attribute where the field type is connection request and the key is interview request, then I can link somebody to this form and say that the interview request, remember that's got to match your key, equals, and we're going to provide this GUID up in the address bar. So that's going to be the GUID of the connection request record that's written into the database. So if we provide that GUID for that connection request, it's going to automatically store that connection request in our workflow attribute. So now when we're showing it in the form, it's pre-filled for us. Now, how do we know that we need to use the GUID to store that connection request in our attribute? That you're going to find documented on our community site. If you go to /lava/workflows, this is going to show you all of the field types that we have available for your workflow attributes and what you need to pass through in the URL or in Lava to store one of those records in that attribute. Now, the cool thing about passing things in using the page parameters like that is that you don't need an action. A lot of people are used to using the workflow entity that gets passed in. Let's say if you start it from a person profile, that needs an action in the workflow to get that entity and to store it in a workflow attribute. But if we use those page parameters, we don't need to have an action to get that information and to store it. The workflow sees those page parameters and automatically stores whatever we pass it in our workflow attributes. But there are some things you need to be aware of. That means that your page's visitor can see that value and they can set their own values. So if you've got a troublemaker like me, if I get linked to a page that has a URL that says person ID equals 4, I'm going to start saying, I wonder what person ID equals 5 is. Or I wonder what connection request ID equals 12 is. And I start typing in numbers just to see what I can see. So the best practice here is going to be to say, make sure to use non-guessable values. And we don't want to trust the input. Just because it's in the URL doesn't mean that we actually link to it. That might be something that one of our troublemaker church members like myself typed in just to see what would happen. In general, passing in another record instead of passing in text like we did with the nickname, if we pass in a record like our connection request, that's probably going to be your best practice, because those GUIDs are so long that they're mathematically guaranteed basically to be unique. You're not going to be able to guess them because no other database is going to generate exactly that same string again ever. That's just how GUIDs are designed to work. So if we pass in a GUID, that means this is almost certainly something that we linked somebody to because they wouldn't have been able to guess that value. And now if we pass in a connection request or a person alias GUID or a campus GUID or something like that, now we know what record we're talking about, and we've got some measure of insurance that they didn't type it in and they're just guessing this, that it actually is a record that exists in our database. But while we're on the subject of entities, I said that we're used to designing workflows to get that entity and to store them in a workflow attribute. Let's talk about how we might want to link somebody to one of our stock workflows if it's designed to require an entity. Now, what I mean by that is we've got some workflows that are designed to be run from the person profile. If we go to the actions menu, we're going to see these workflows that we can run, and we know that that's going to pass in as an entity the record of the person whose profile we started that workflow from. So if we start the background check from Ted's profile, That workflow is designed to expect an entity to be passed in. It's going to expect TED to be provided as the entity, and it's going to say, I want to update one of my attributes based on that entity that was passed in. We also know that we probably don't want to edit one of these stock workflows. So it would be great to be able to go to a connection request and start a background check from that connection request. But the problem is, if we start a background check workflow using one of our built-in connection request workflow triggers, it's going to send the entity of the connection request and not the person. So if we're designing our own workflow, that's great, because if we know this is always going to be sent to connection request, we can design that workflow to expect a connection request and get the person from there. The way that we would do that is to use this Lava template. When we're setting an attribute from the entity, we'd use entity.personalias.GUID. That's going to get the person from the connection request and put them into a person attribute. But what happens if it's not your workflow? Like I said, if you want to start a background check from a connection request, we know that we don't want to edit the core background check workflow to change what type of entity it gets passed in, but I do want to be able to start it from the connection request. The way to do that is to create a launcher. So this is going to be like an in-between workflow. So we're going to have a workflow that says get background check from connection request, and we could set that up as a workflow trigger if we wanted to, so that it's one of those manual buttons on the connection request. Here's the two things that we need to do in this workflow. We need to start by getting the person from the connection request. So this particular workflow knows it's going to be past the connection request. We want to look up the person who's the requester for that request using the Lava template that I just gave you. Once we have that, then we want to redirect you to the page that actually runs the background check. So we want to provide the person for that request as the entity for our background check workflow. So let's say that our background check workflow has an ID of 18. We're going to pass in person ID, and we want to look up the ID of the person who was the requester in that connection request. So we get the person ID, and then we redirect to the actual workflow entry, the workflow we actually want to run, using that Lava of the workflow attribute requester, and we want to get the ID out of that. And make sure that when we create this launcher workflow that we're not persisting this. Now the cool thing about this method is it's kind of like magic. Because when I was telling you, okay, we're going to link to the background check workflow and provide the person ID and the page parameter, your mind probably started attaching that to what we talked about a couple minutes ago with those page parameters and saying, I didn't realize that the background check had a person ID attribute. Well, if you come over and look at the background check attributes, it doesn't have a person ID attribute. The reason that I say it works like magic is that if you pass in a person ID or a group ID page parameter, the workflow is going to look up the appropriate person or group and pass those into the workflow as the entity. So it's kind of short-circuiting the logic. Instead of putting that ID number into one of the workflow attributes, it's actually going to look up the entity and pass it in as the workflow entity. That way our launcher is going to link us to the workflow entry for the background check and provide the person as the workflow entity that core workflow is designed to look for. So this is available for person ID and for group ID parameters. If I pass in a person ID in the page parameter or a group ID, Rock is going to go and get that corresponding record and pass it in as the workflow entity. Now, while we're talking about the workflow entry and starting workflows and linking to workflows, remember how a couple slides ago we said that we can't trust inputs? We can't trust things that have been put into the address bar? That's going to apply also to our workflow entry blocks. Here's an example of a page that you might have set up on your external site. If we've got a page route that says workflow entry and then it's looking for a workflow type ID, then we can link to this page and very nicely say, when they load this page, start workflow type ID of 13, and that's going to show us the contact us form just like we wanted it to. But then you get the troublemaker in your church like myself, and I see the 13 up there and I say, I wonder what happens if I launch 14 or if I type in 14. Well, now this contact us page says, here's a form that I can fill out to request that the maintenance team addresses a facilities issue. Oops, that's not what we want. That by having the workflow type ID up in the page parameters, we're actually allowing somebody to run almost any type of workflow in our system. So ways to avoid that is, if you look at your workflow entry block, we've got a couple settings that you should evaluate. One is the workflow type setting. If this is blank, then it's going to look in the address bar. It's going to look in those page parameters to figure out which type of workflow to run. But if you fill in something, it's only going to run that particular type of workflow. So if I say the workflow type on this particular block is external inquiry, then whenever I load this page and that block runs, it's only going to run external inquiry. I don't need to provide that ID or the GUID or any type of parameter that tells that block which workflow to run. It already knows it, so it's going to ignore any information, any instructions that I give it to run something else. So if you have one page that should always run exactly one workflow, use the workflow type setting in the block settings to make sure that no other type of workflow will ever be able to be run from that page. Another option, though, if you didn't want to do that, you could leave that blank and say we're going to disable passing a workflow ID. Because remember, passing an ID is really easy to make up. I could change 13 to 14 and I'm probably going to guess something that does correspond to an actual workflow type. If we say, though, on this block, we don't want you to be able to pass in a workflow ID, you can see here that the help text says that's going to require you to pass in the workflow GUID instead. So now we can use an address like this. We could use workflow entry and then pass in the workflow type GUID instead of the ID. They're never going to be able to guess a GUID of another valid workflow type. So this is a lot safer than passing in the workflow ID. So those are going to be ways of making sure that your workflows are nicely secured without actually having to mess with security on the workflows themselves. Now, the last section that I want to go through is a bit of an odd section, given that what we're talking about are best practices for workflows, because this section is all about how to not use workflows. Remember, workflows are like programs. They have to be well designed. We got to make sure that they shut down and that they're not running for years and years. Sometimes they're like spinning up a big bulldozer just to drive in a nail. Workflows can be a really heavy process in terms of what they have to write to the database and the processing power that they need just to capture information. So if all we want to do is get some information, if all we want to show is a basic form, there may be some other ways to collect input other than designing a workflow and using a form. One of those ways, let's say that we want to have a page that has a form to allow people to provide questions for God. Maybe we've got a sermon series coming up and we want them to be able to ask questions, and our team's going to look at all the questions that got asked and create the sermon series based on that. Instead of having a workflow gather that information and then having to figure out where to store it, we could actually put a content channel entry block on the external site on a specific page and lock down the content channel type to where all they enter is the title and the content. Or maybe we could even get rid of the content and just have them add the title if all we need is a question. So when we're creating a content channel type like this, maybe we give it a name of public questions. We want to disable priority, disable the status, don't have any dates, and don't show in any of our channel lists. So now we're just asking them for the title and the content, or we could even say, go ahead and disable the content, and all we're asking for is the title. Now when they submit that, it's going to create a new content channel item in a specific channel, this public questions channel, and we can go and look at all of the posts in that channel. There doesn't necessarily have to be a page designed to show all of those posts that have been made, but our team can go and look at all the questions just by scrolling through all of the items in that content channel. So we've gathered some information and we've stored it somewhere in just a record without having to write all of these records to the database by spinning up a workflow. We've got the information and it's just stored statically in our content channel items instead. Another option, if we're gathering information because we want to follow up with somebody especially, might be a connection request. You know about connection requests and how on the external site we can allow people to search for volunteer opportunities and create this request that somebody gets assigned and then follows through and make sure that you eventually get plugged in with that ministry and that you're serving with them. But there's lots of other uses for connection requests as well. Connection requests are great whenever we want to make sure that someone on staff follows up with the person who filled out the form. The great thing about connection requests also is that we can add attributes to these connection requests so that we can store more information than just what's built into Rock automatically. So every connection request is going to ask you for your name and your contact information, and it's going to allow you to have some comments down at the bottom. But we can add multiple fields here in the middle just by signing up for a connection request. So when we design these opportunities or these types, we create a connection request attribute and mark those attributes as public. And we can even put them in categories. So if we've got a category of personal history and we've got an attribute that says, do you attend our church? Yes or no? Tell me a little bit about yourself. And then we've got another category of counseling history, and that's got an attribute that says, have you attended counseling before? Yes or no? If all three of those attributes are marked as public, then when I'm signing up for one of these connection requests, it's going to ask me for that information. And as soon as I click connect, it's going to create the connection request and store that information that I provided in the connection request itself. So we didn't have to create a workflow to gather the information and then create the connection request and store all of that in. That's the whole purpose of that block. That connection opportunity sign up block does that for you with no workflow needed at all. And since we had those categories of personal history and counseling history, the connection request is even going to categorize those attributes that they filled out into tabs on the connection request. So we can look at personal history, and here we've got, do you attend our church? Yes or no? Tell me a little bit about yourself, and whatever they typed in there. And then if we click on counseling history tab, then we see the answer to the question that they provided for, have you attended counseling before? So those headers show up when we are requesting the information, and then they're even more useful for our staff on the internal side when we're looking at that request that got created and we're needing to follow up with them. When we add that connection opportunity sign up block to your external site's page, the thing that you need to look for is the connection opportunity, because that says whenever I load the page with this block on it, which opportunity are they signing up for? You also want to make sure to exclude non-public connection request attributes. So you could have some attributes that the staff need to fill out once the connection request exists, and we don't want to prompt the requester for that information. Then you can mark those attributes as non-public. You can uncheck the public box, and by making sure that this block says exclude the non-public connection request attributes, it won't ask them for those. So we can distinguish which of them show up and which of them don't. So that's a couple different ways of providing some forms on your website without having to use a workflow every time. Let's talk about using some single-purpose workflows. The idea here is we want to update central records so we don't need to persist workflows. We want our workflows to run, do whatever they need to do, and then close as quickly as possible. So especially with something like the connection request, we want to add workflows into it, and we want to make sure that the information actually lives in the connection request. The way that we talk about this is that workflows are kind of like the muscles in your body. They are really strong. They do powerful things. They move everything around. You couldn't do a whole lot without them, but they are useless by themselves. If you had muscles without the skeleton, then they're just kind of a blob on the ground. They need something to grab onto so that they can move things around. The workflows are your muscles. They move things, but they always need the structure underlying them. So one way of one way of launching a workflow from your connection request is by using the built-in workflow triggers. So either something that happens automatically or something that happens when I click a button. These buttons are always available on your connection requests. So we could have a button that says set a future follow-up of 2 weeks. And when I click this button, it's going to send the connection request as the workflow entity to my workflow. And then the workflow could take actions like set the future follow-up date to 2 weeks in the future and change the status of the connection request to future follow-up. And then it can send you back to the connection request itself. But sometimes we want to be able to launch workflows only when certain things are true. So maybe only when a workflow is in a specific status or state, or only when a particular connection request attribute has a value, or only be able to launch this workflow when one of these attributes is blank. One way that we can do that is by using the block setting called the Lava badge bar. So this allows us to add any kind of HTML or Lava that we want to, and it's going to show up between the attributes, or above the attributes and below the comments that they provided. So our template here might say the next steps based on the attribute values or based on the status or the state of our connection request is you need to click on this workflow and fill out the intake form. So that button is something that we would provide in HTML. And maybe that links us to counseling intake form, and then it provides the connection request attribute value or attribute key and the connection request GUID. So that's going to say whatever our current connection request, get the GUID and give that as the value to this connection request. Now when that workflow launches, you already know it's going to take this connection request and put it into the workflow attribute with the key of connection request. So if I click on that button, maybe this is what the workflow shows me. It's got question 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it's got some information as part of the intake for this request. Please record the answers to these questions that we've asked them. So if we jump over and look at the workflow itself, we're going to need 5 attributes to do that. We'd have the connection request itself, and the key here is connection request. That's why our URL parameter worked. And then we've got the 4 questions, and the field types in those examples are memo. So the workflow design is first we're going to show the form and get the answers to those 4 questions. And then we're going to update the connection request attribute for question 1, for 2, 3, and for 4. So this is going to use the entity attribute set. We want to update another records attributes. So it says, okay, what type of entity is it that we're going to be updating? And it's a connection request. And then it says, which connection request is it? We want to use the attribute that we've already set in the URL, indicating which connection request it is. What's the attribute key that we're going to update, and what value are we going to put into that attribute? So it's getting and using all of our existing workflow attributes that were submitted in the form and storing that information in the connection request. So we have the form, and then we update question 1 in the connection request, question 2 in the connection request, question 3, and question 4. So that way, all the information that it gathered gets stored in the connection request. We're not storing it in the workflow. We're not even persisting the workflow. We don't need a record that ran. We just wanted a nice experience for our staff to be able to provide the information so that when the connection request shows the attribute values, we can see the answers that they gave to each of those questions. So all of the information lives in the connection request. The workflows are single purpose workflows that go out and run very quickly and close as quickly as possible, but they're writing all the information back to that central record, in this case, our connection request. We don't need to persist the workflows. We don't need to have any types of features that leave them running over there. because they're just going to run, gather the information, and close and redirect you back to the connection request. And all the information lives in the connection request itself, which is just data in your database. It's not a program like the workflow would be if we left it running. So congratulations, you made it to the end of this presentation.